We have a lot of people who contribute all the time and contribute to this organization and this gathering in many different ways. We are fortunate here to have Nadine for lots of reasons. Her history in doing what she does and standing up for equality in so many ways for so many years. But just this week, if we could have the visual, please, if that one's going to come up for us, that'd be great. She was named to a pretty illustrious list here by a major publication. She was named one of Time's most influential people of the year. Under the auspices, they broke it up into different categories. This one was icons for her work with Equality Florida for so many years, for doing so many things great. And I'm dying to hear what she has to say. She is the executive director of Equality Florida, and her quote is, "We have a constitutional problem, folks, and it doesn't stop in Florida." She's been fighting this battle for 3 decades. Do say gay. Please welcome Nadine Smith. Nadine.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. And as I said when we were doing our introductions, I'm getting a lot of calls these days from conferences who are asking, hey, we're scheduled to be in Florida this year, next year, year after. Should we be canceling because of this? And my answer has been to the conferences that want to cancel and the conferences that don't, if you're canceling, thank you for taking a stand. It's important that we take a stand. And for the ones who are coming, I say, great. While you're here, make sure you take a stand. Make sure your presence here makes a difference. What we cannot have in this moment is silence. I remember the moment I realized that Donald Trump was going to become the next president. It was in 2015, and I was at a conference, Leadership Florida Conference, which is, you probably have Leadership Ohio or Kentucky or what have you, but it's kind of the movers and the shakers, the elected leaders, the titans of industry, and then they let a few nonprofits through the door as well. And so we were having our last meeting. It was in a ballroom in a hotel in Miami, and it was something like the demographics of consumer. I can't remember. It was putting me to sleep, and I thought, I'm going to sit in the back. I'm just going to be on my phone and try not to be rude. And the demographer was a guy named Jeffrey Johnson. He was out of University of North Carolina, older black man with lots of grandpa jokes. And once all of the introductions were done, he grabbed my attention because he said this. He said, America is in the middle of a demographic convulsion that is about to alter all of our cultural, political, and social institutions and our economy. And he said, and the demographic convulsion is this. It is the graying of America and the browning of America. It is an older population that, because of healthcare disparities and other, economic factors, is largely white, and an emerging generation where no single racial group will be dominant. And the existential panic that demographic reality creates for that first group is having a profound impact on the future of our country. And one of the ways that it is, they say, what is it? Every accusation is a confession. Like the fear of being a minority in America is a confession about how minorities are treated in America. And so, as he was saying this, I was thinking, here we came, the Obama 2-term presidency, and yet what we were seeing was more rancor, more polarization, things that went to the heart of, we had a president for 2 terms who a solid constituency within the Republican Party would not accept was even an American citizen. So the reason I'm bringing this up at an LGBTQ travel and tourism space is because we have to understand the dynamic that we are in right now to understand why these things are playing out the way they do. We have to understand why the attack on critical race theory, I'm putting it in quotes because usually when they're talking about critical race theory, they're not actually talking about, it's just the placeholder for saying, I don't like to talk about things about America's history and current state around race. And anything that makes me uncomfortable, I want that removed. It is not accidental that the attacks on having honest conversations on race and the censorship, book banning, curriculum shaping forces behind Don't Say Gay are in tandem. And we have seen it before. Here in Florida in the 50s into the early 60s, there was the Johns Committee. I won't tell you all about it. It's worth Googling. I know people personally whose lives were destroyed by the Johns Committee, but they existed to do two things: to eliminate black civil rights advocates and purge homosexuals from the Florida education system. It was a committee run by the state legislature. But then you can fast forward more to my era, and you remember Anita Bryant and her Save Our Children campaign. She used some of the same ugly rhetoric that we're hearing coming out of DeSantis's office when he talks about groomers, aka pedophiles. Anita Bryant was funded by the moral majority. And at that moment, the moral majority wasn't talking about abortion. They were talking about school integration. And here we are now, where the Stop Woke Act that didn't just circumscribe what can be taught in schools, but it also said to private businesses, we're going to tell you what you can and can't say to your employees when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're going to create the ability for an employee to sue you for up to $10,000 if they don't like what is included in your diversity or your human relations or any kind of training to create a safe space. And more than that, the governor also sent word out to major companies. You don't have to raise your hand if you all got the memo. Don't you dare cross me. I'm going after this legislation, and you better stay silent. And so what you have then is this tension of these values that a lot of companies have adopted, embraced, told their employees that they believe these things. When they recruited talent, they said, these are our values. We walk the talk. We do it. And here came this moment when the governor, without any ambiguity, was sending the message that LGBT students and LGBT parents must be treated as second-class citizens in our schools, and don't you say a word. Now, that tension is where we're living right now. But Florida is a microcosm, and we should not think that this is a Florida problem. We should think of this as an American problem, because this bill is not just unique to Florida. We are seeing it introduced in state after state. I got invited to Los Angeles because Camila Cabello was going to do a benefit concert for Equality Florida and Lambda Legal. And I remember when I got to the venue, there were a lot of our sponsors, a lot of good folks who were putting this together, and they were like, oh, wow, things must be really rough in Florida. It must be really hard, I'm glad you're getting a break being here in California. And part of me was very grateful, of course, that they were doing this extraordinary event for us. But part of me was like, y'all have to open your eyes. This is not just a Florida problem. There were two dads who got on a train with their child and encountered somebody who cornered their 5-year-old and said, those aren't your dads, those are rapists. Began to berate this family in front of their child, who was shaking and in tears, and called them groomers, the words issued from Governor DeSantis's office. Luckily, that man was escorted off the train, was removed before he escalated further. But that wasn't a train from Orlando, that was a train from Los Angeles. And so we have to understand that Anita Bryant started here, but she took her Save Our Children campaign all the way to California. So it's important that we take this very, very seriously. And the reason that this language around groomer, pedophile, predatory, ought to make everybody in this room furious is because it is exterminationist language. It is language intended to associate us with something so horrible that if harm comes to us, who cares? Don't we feel that way about anyone who would harm a child? Throw them under the building. Don't just put them in prison. We have this revulsion toward people who would do harm to children, to the point that eliminating them from society is deemed a moral good. That is how dangerous this moment is, and I want everyone to just let that seep in. Right after the Trump election, I and a group of religious organizations and civil rights organizations, we held an event called Love Not Fear, and we held it at the Holocaust Museum in downtown St. Petersburg. And we said we need to have a place where people can talk across differences, because all of this build the wall, all of these kinds of things that are intended to separate and polarize us, were just dominating the conversation. You had schools where kids who'd gotten along, suddenly kids were chanting, build a wall towards, Hispanic students. There was a way that level of meanness was taking hold. And in the same way, after the ban on openly serving in the military ended, and you had the top brass delivering the message that this is how it will be, I had friends in the military who said it was like day and night. Like once that order went out, the entire vibe changed. There was a level of, that's how it is now, right? But the ability to flip that switch that way reminds us that there's the ability to flip it the other way. And so we wanted to bring all of these folks together, and it was in fact, it was an amazing event because we had the second largest room reserved, but based on the RSVPs that came in, it was like, oh, we're going to need a bigger boat, so we took over the larger room. And then we had to we had to create it so that there were cameras or videos in all of the rooms for the overflow of people who turned out. And for the first time, they had to turn people away from at the door because we were exceeding capacity. That's how hungry people were to have these conversations across these divides. And we did this one exercise at the end where we said, if you've never met someone of the Sikh faith, if you've never talked to somebody of this race, of this, sexual orientation, if you've never had those conversations, use this moment to have those conversations. It was a really powerful event. But what I could not forget from that night, as I got there early, was I actually walked through the exhibit. And it turned out that exhibit happened to be about Germany. There was part of it that was talking about how, in many ways, Germany was at the leading edge of LGBT, gay liberation at the time. Lots of gay bars, a cultural center, a intellectual center, a social center for the community. And that it took people time to really recognize that something was shifting, something very ominous was happening, and that it was happening by degrees, rights curtailed in these small ways that didn't quite, create a disequilibrium, but there were nefarious signs. And that's why there were some people who were like, we're getting out of here, and other people who were like, no, this is a much more progressive place than that. Things will settle down, things will become a little bit better. And so there's a argument in oratory that says the first person to evoke Hitler loses the argument, right? But I think we have crossed the whatever parallel that stops you from saying that now. We are seeing in Texas the governor and the state attorney attempting to create a world in which parents are arrested and their children taken away if those parents are giving gender-affirming, life-saving care to their kid. We are seeing in Florida, even before the Don't Say Gay bill comes into effect, teachers losing their jobs. We are seeing teachers being told, take down anything that has rainbows in it. 4 teachers in Sarasota were told to remove their coexist posters, which is about religious tolerance, because they had a rainbow motif. We're seeing good teachers quit their jobs. The U.S. military has announced that they will station service members who are in states where there is such hostility towards their family that it is no longer safe. And me and my 2 older brothers were born on a military base in Maine, primarily because my biracial mother, who was British, was assumed to be white by military brass, and so my father could only be stationed at certain military bases where interracial couples were legally permitted to live. So I know I've put this in pretty stark terms. I don't want to pull any punches because you're all from all over the place, and I want you to understand that, you know, the boiling of the frog by degrees is happening. But I also want to say this. I am 56. I'm old enough to have been through a number of fights, and this is what I also know. Around AIDS and HIV, we did not cower and curl up and wait for whatever punch came next. We acted up. We changed the way the medical world functioned. We looked out for each other. And I think what you see with the Gaber program is that that hunger to be in each other's company is really strong because the world feels very unsafe right now for many of us, especially those of us in red states. I also know this, during the marriage fight, 38 states in a row said, you all can't have what we have. You do not get the same protections. Your kids do not get the same security our kids get. But I remember when we lost in 2008 in Florida, Obama had won and we had lost. It was a very strange moment to try to find my footing. But I remember looking over the polling that came over the next few months, and something really fascinating became clear. Even though Florida had done this, support for everything else we were working for and for marriage increased significantly in the aftermath. It was as though there'd been this sort of riot and they were surveying the damage afterwards. But what I really think happened was there were a lot of people who didn't think of themselves as particularly political, who suddenly felt that hurt and were expressing it around family and friends in ways they never had. And people who didn't think much about it and just cast their ballot whatever the way their pastor said, or, based on their upbringing, but not a whole lot of knowledge, were suddenly really thinking much more deeply. And so that's why we went after marriage equality in Florida, even though a lot of national orgs said, you guys aren't going to get marriage, not in Florida, not before the Supreme Court. But we did. We got it before Bergefeld. Through a campaign where we told our love stories. We didn't talk about this in terms of, health insurance and contracts and these antiseptic ways that so much of the conversation had been framed for years around marriage equality. And so in this moment, what I know about the journey of LGBT equality, what I know is this. When we come through to these moments of extreme despair, of extraordinary backlash, they are hard, they have a body count. It is personally challenging to see any light at the end of the tunnel. But on the other side, we don't just get through it, we catapult forward. We went from losing 38 times in a row to marriage equality being the law of the land. And so the thing that makes me hopeful in this moment is what I will call what is known as the Streisand effect. Barbara Streisand discovered that her house was part of the aerial mapping of Google, and she didn't like that. And so she told them to take it down. They didn't. I think she took them to court and was not successful. And here's the thing. When she first discovered it, only 4 people had downloaded the picture. By the time all of the publicity subsided, like somewhere between, around 6 million people had downloaded the photo. Every time they tried to suppress and repress and erase us, it has the opposite effect. It makes us more determined. And the thing that gives me the greatest hope right now is the fact that students organized themselves and poured out of their classrooms. They held walkouts. They came to Tallahassee. They've begun registering voters on their campus. They turned June graduation into opportunities to protest Don't Say Gay. And that activism is continuing to grow. And so I want to say this, as you do what you do, it is important. I will leave you with these messages. Whenever you come to Florida, make sure you raise your voice. Use it as an opportunity to talk about how nefarious this attack, this relentless attack on the LGBTQ community is. When you talk to companies, we talk about the Great Resignation, we talk about the shrinking talent pool. We will remember who stood with us and who ducked the fight. I thought I was legally required to drive a Subaru as a lesbian. Forest Green. And because we pay attention, perhaps more than any other community, to who stood up when it counted and who backed into the shadows. And I know that part of our work is going to be to make sure that those champions that stand up, that the whole community knows who they are. And so in this moment, I would say there's going to come a showdown. We have a governor who wants to be president, who wants to outflank Trump to the right in order to secure his nomination in 2024. And that's what's driving so much of that. It has nothing to do with what Floridians want. It has everything to do with a network of donors across the state, across the country that see him, as the great white hope. And so he's not influenced by what people in Florida need. But wherever you are, you have the ability to speak out against this, to speak out against book banning and censorship, to speak out against the vilification and dehumanization of our community, to speak out against a governor who would take our bodily autonomy away, who would take away the rights of parents to do everything they can to provide health care and life-saving, affirming health care to their children. And I hope that you will use your voices to do that. And yes, Orlando is a great and welcoming city. Tampa is a great and welcoming city. Where I live in St. Petersburg, great and welcoming cities. And they are going to be under increasing pressure to differentiate themselves from Florida. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. I thank you for being present for the hard part of this conversation. But I also will tell you that I am the most optimistic person you will meet. And my optimism comes from a belief that in these moments, it is even more important for us to have a vision of a future that is inclusive for all of us, where we're not just talking about stopping the bullying, but talking about an environment where our children, our lives, we can thrive. And so it has been a pleasure to have been at the first Thrive. It's a pleasure to be with you now, and I hope that you will all stay in touch, reach out. We are happy. Equality Florida is part of the Florida Chamber. We have our own Equality Means Business program. We work closely with business because we know that sometimes business is the only force strong enough to push back against governmental tyranny. So thank you all so very much for inviting me.
Wow. Thank you for that. And again, congratulations on the time thing. I understand you're splitting right out of here to fly to New York for a.
I will be heading to New York.
Very
yes.
good.
I'm so terrified that I'm going to get COVID. They test you like 24 hours before each event. So I've been COVID free this whole time.
And as a fellow Saint, we both live in St. Pete, Florida, the Berg. And I have a question for you on Florida. And I was thinking of this the other day, and I thought of it more this morning. Is that how do you reconcile Florida's reputation nationally and internationally, given the fact that Florida twice elected a black president? And Florida, in the DeSantis election, he only won by 0.4%, half of 1%. How do we reconcile that as the brand of Florida?
Well, I mean, listen, when you say Florida man, nobody's thinking you're talking about a Nobel laureate, right? We have, so Florida has a certain kind of reputation to begin with.
I think that's their new tourism slogan. Yeah,
might as well be. I think that the challenge with Florida is that we have had one party in power for decades, and the consolidation of that power has eliminated accountability. It's created an environment where, they've just drawn maps that are intended to, ensure that they remain in power.
Not they, the governor drew
the governor. Honestly, the Florida, I will say this. Okay, so for 23 years, this is Equality Florida's 25th year, For 23 years, we were able to stop every single anti-LGBT piece of legislation by building a coalition of moderate Republicans, Democrats who were passionate on the issue, and business leadership who would speak out either in front of the camera or at least behind the scenes. And through that coalition, we stopped a lot of bad things. What began in the Trump years was it became about loyalty. Actually, fealty is probably the better word. You didn't have to just be loyal. You had to demonstrate your loyalty. You had to do it publicly, even if it meant humiliating yourself. That is the operation. That is the modus operandi of our current governor. And so moderate legislators who stood with us on a variety of things are either gone out of the legislature, primaried, or retired, just, because they were unwilling to acquiesce, or they became compliant.
Do you think other companies in Florida and around the U.S. Really paid attention to the Disney episode, or do you think that's a one-off, or is that TBD? What is your take on that?
In what sense? They certainly paid attention. But
right. In terms of, do you think they lessened their support or their openness for things that may be considered the antithetical of the current administration?
I think that there's a reckoning coming for CEOs around this issue. I think that a couple of things happened after North Carolina's HB2. A lot of companies stepped up and said, hey, listen, you've created an environment that is hostile to our people. NCAA said, we're pulling out. Springsteen and others said, we won't play in your state. And the economic impact of that was massive. And so, we saw that as a victory. Businesses were walking the talk. What began to happen after that, though, there was a concerted effort to go after companies and to punish them. So you saw in Georgia, where I think it was Coca-Cola and Delta both spoke up, somewhat reluctantly at first, but finally spoke up against a slate of legislation that was intended to suppress the black vote. They were immediately punished by the legislature. And there's even a tie to gerrymandering there, because what you end up with is a disproportionate representation by places that have fewer people.
Sure.
Right? And so more rural places were willing to punish some of the biggest employers in their state for standing up on the values of democracy. But then you began to see that happening. They began to call it woke culture. Woke corporations were going to be publicly punished. And we've seen this in Florida. We see this in the rhetoric they've used even before now. And it's pretty clear that they sent a message, a very specific message to companies in Florida saying, stay out of our lane or we will punish you, which is why they've tried to make an example of Disney. They just, yesterday, I think it was, DeSantis vetoed money from the Rays because the Rays were right. tweeting stats on gun violence in America. Yeah.
And they had one at the game right in St. Pete, which is interesting to me because I thought of Disney in a lot of different ways. One word that never really came to mind for me with Disney was woke. It seems such a conservative behemoth, a family-friendly, safe, inside thing. And to use that title and just stick it on it, and all of a sudden the wokeness of this. Going back to the larger question of equality, though, I remember, after the Equality of Marriage Act, and I talked about this earlier, when it was basically de facto law of the land where gay marriage was legal. Did Equality Florida or other equality organizations throughout the U.S., did they feel like they had a little bit of a mission accomplished? What do we do now? What was the thinking at that moment? And did you ever think we'd be sitting now here thinking that is just up on the block as anything is right now, and in any Supreme Court decision?
Well, our message was in that moment was the backlash is coming. And I would not have predicted the swiftness or the intensity of it, but it has, historically, this is what happens.
So in your mind, this is a direct reaction to?
Oh, well, it's a reaction to a lot of things. Right now, I think the reason that we're seeing such a focus on schools and curriculum and CRT and Don't Say Gay and school boards, I think has as much to do with the summer of protest in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder captured on film, where, again, this demographic divide was saying, look, young people are willing, of all races, are willing to take to the streets. They're willing to upend the apple cart across the board. And so we've got to get back to a level of indoctrination in our schools that will realign things. Learning too much about racial history has created an environment in which young people are willing to push back. So we've got to tamp that down. And so I think that a lot of this, it's not one single event. It's this sort of cumulative sense that power is slipping away from those who have held it, and that the emerging, demographic, it's in the same way they were sprinting state by state by state to block marriage equality. They felt like the tide was turning, and they needed to put these barriers up before public opinion shifted so far that it was past the tipping point. And so that same energy is at play now with this assault on curriculum that says, this is how maddening it is. They challenge, in one school district in Florida, Moms for Liberty, aka Klan Moms, challenged 156 books, saying most of them either had black authors or had LGBT characters. And so they described a book based on the true story of two penguins raising a chick in a New York zoo called And Tango Makes Three. They described it as obscene because the two penguins are male. They challenged a book called Mama, Mommy, and Me, just because it's two moms raising a daughter, as pornographic. And the one that I thought was really despicable was My Two Dads. They described that one as pornographic, and they point to an illustration of a kid sitting on one of their dad's laps, which they described as a child with his buttocks pressed against the zipper of an adult man. As a parent of an 11-year-old son, I can barely say that sentence without, just bursting into a total fury. This is how dangerous the rhetoric is. And so I want to, how far they have gone. They rejected 41% of math textbooks for being awash in woke CRT, social emotional learning. The movie Hidden Figures. There was one blurb in one math book about how she was the first black woman, in this position at NASA. They're like, why do we have to point that out? Why do we make it about race? So they wanted that eliminated. And the book vendors who wanted the market in Florida eliminated everything they told them to.
Capitulated. So what are the bright lights? Let's end on a happy note. Where do you look for inspiration? What's going right? Where should we rally behind? And I love what you said, that silence is not an option. So bring us to a place of how we're looking forward.
Well, I think part of what you hear in my voice is that this is, at the government level, at the state level, even when Florida voted for Obama twice, it was still electing Republican, not just Republicans, but arch-conservative Republicans in our state legislature because of how the districts are drawn. And so I do not believe the Florida legislature reflects where the majority of Floridians are. I think a strong majority of Floridians believe in LGBTQ equality, believe in racial equity, believe in these values, and will stand up for them. Unfortunately, our political infrastructure has been rigged in such a way that those voices don't necessarily get heard in Tallahassee, or don't matter, because that's not what drives things in Tallahassee. So what gives me hope is this. It gives me hope that Disney actually course-corrected at a time when it might have been easier for them politically not to. It gives me hope that we have heard from more and more companies that are feeling the pressure internal from their talent, who are saying, do what you said you would do, be who you said you are. And those companies are beginning also to course correct. I am heartened by the fact that, for example, Anita B. which is a massive organization of women in tech that are coming to Florida, have made all of their media around coming to Florida a criticism of the Don't Say Gay bill and Stop Woke, and they're leveraging that platform. There's grants in health that have added an entire panel and plenary on this. So we're beginning to see folks who didn't necessarily speak up in the moment showing up now and showing up with a very strong voice. And so, but fundamentally, what gives me hope is where I began. We are in a demographic shift in America, and there's two roads. And one road is an attempt to drag us backwards, and that road includes, that road isn't really a road, it's just a path of destruction, right? It's just about stopping progress. The other path, and it's the one that demographics, the math of it bears out, is that the generations that are coming into power don't believe this rhetoric. They're not fearful of their LGBTQ friends, neighbors, family members. They're not fearful of a multiracial world. They're not fearful of difference. They care about the climate, and they care about preserving, our natural spaces. And, there's a change that is coming. And so for me, it is about how do we mitigate how much harm gets done as that shift comes into its full power. And so what gives me hope is that there are a whole lot of parents that never thought they would be political that I see showing up because now the governor's coming after their kids. There's a whole lot of people who are awakening to how insidious this is, and it's not just one state. In fact, this bill was created by a think tank, and they are propagating this all over. But a lot of those places are rejecting it. And I just want to shout out to Republican governors, like the Republican governor of Utah, who vetoed a bill going after trans kids and said he's never seen so much hatred directed towards such a small minority of people. You had I think it was the Republican governor of, is it Indiana? Who also spoke up, yeah, I can talk to who also spoke up. And just today I saw, I think Louisiana their Don't Say Gay bill died. And so I'm seeing this awakening, and I think that our voices collectively, it's in all of these small conversations. It's in these places where you say, hey,
Sure.
You know what, given a choice between that city or that state and that state, we're going to put our resources in the state that's actually willing to respect who we are. And this is my message to CEOs. I've had lots of conversations with big companies lately. And I've said, listen, when you adopted diversity, equity, and inclusion years ago, you did it because it was right for your business. It made you more competitive. It helped you recruit and keep talent. That was a business decision. When you ducked the conversation around a law that would have a direct impact on your employees, their kids, and your customers, that was a political decision. So get out of politics, get back to business, and do what you said you would do, be who you said you are, and walk the talk of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And you talk about all of our voices coming together. I can't be happier to have you as someone from Florida and someone from St. Pete, but have the loudest and most articulate voice of all be you. And thank you for that, and congratulations on the time thing. And we hope we're with you every year. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.